Hello, everyone. We'll start in about a couple minutes. Give it about a minute left, and then we'll start. All right, thank you for coming to this webinar. This is our Executive Education webinar series. And today we're going to have Dr. Patrick Lynch, who is a faculty member here at Thunderbird. And he will be introducing his topic, which is why Industry 4.0 leaders embrace digital change agents and experimentation cultures. I do want to say before we actually start, if you can leave all your questions to the Q&A at the end of the webinar, and that will be through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Once you submit your questions, you can do it anonymously or you can attach your name to it, but please leave all the questions for the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this started. Dr. Patrick Lynch, everyone.
Welcome all. Good day, good evening. Thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate also the Thunderbird leadership giving us this opportunity to share the great topic today with you. Very much pleased to be here. I instruct big data analytics in the global economy and also some decision making with analytics in our graduate, online, and in-person programs and also at the undergraduate level here at Thunderbird. And so happy to have this topic today that's sort of related to all of those things. Also, this is very much a practitioner perspective. I'm a clinical professor. I still do active consulting. And so I've really tried to keep that in mind as if we were having coffee together. Maybe we could actually just share some ideas today. So I'll point out that some of these are very much just sort of formative observations and some things that we have some active research going on. But I think it's just more a pragmatic kind of talk. So with that, overall today we're going to be looking at Industry 4.0, so we'll touch on that a little bit. I think it's important actually to have that as a grounding kind of foundation to put this into some kind of context, and I'll be interested to hear from or read maybe later your comments on how you are interpreting Industry 4.0, but we'll cover some of that. And then we're going to be talking about change and change for organizations and organizational culture that are related to the digital transformations that are part of Industry 4.0. And then we'll wrap up just touching on some patterns that we're seeing around experimentation. So experimenting in our companies to serve our customers better through these kinds of techniques is what we'll be talking about. So we really want to start today, since we're talking about a very technical topic, with obviously the epicenter where a lot of these kinds of digital changes are happening. Very popular place. Many of you already know its name, where digital innovation starts, and that's going to be Sweden. I know many of you might have thought I was going to say Silicon Valley, but Sweden is really actually where we want to start with our story today. And we actually want to wind back the clock just a bit. To one of the most phenomenal changes that I often draw on when I'm thinking about organizational change, and that is the change that happened in Sweden in going from driving on the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Now, to give you some perspective, this is a modern day view of downtown Stockholm, which is obviously one of the major cities there in Sweden. And I think you can appreciate how complicated it would be to change all of the traffic patterns in a city of this size. Imagine yourself if tomorrow, instead of in your daily commute or wherever you were going today, you were waking up and having to drive on the opposite side of the road. You can appreciate that a little bit more looking at the density of the population. Again, it's today, but still a major city, and it was a major change that was going to happen for the whole country. And it was a change that was going to be difficult to do in some kind of an incremental fashion. It would be more difficult to think of having a single street sort of adopt the pattern, but then the street next to it not. We can imagine the kind of gridlock and maybe even risk that would pose to the population. And so they knew this, that it was going to be a significant change for the country to switch, but they were motivated to do so because their neighbors by the 1960s, the neighboring countries had already made the switch. They're driving on the right-hand side of the road. And many of the cars that even were being driven in Sweden were really ideal for that, which is a left-hand drive car driving on the right-hand side of the road. You can imagine that it would be precarious if cars maybe were approaching each other and drivers were on different sides. Difficult to judge the distance it is safe to pass, or other kinds of challenges with turning and things like that. So finally, by 1963, the Parliament adopted that they were going to go forward with the change. And that kicked off a series of 4 years of effectively experiments, what I'll call them today, to try to evaluate where those changes needed to take place. It produced all kinds of literature to figure out what kinds of information people were going to need. They were talking with people in the community, members in the very neighborhoods, on what kinds of roads they were driving on, and seeing whether or not it was going to mean a significant change for that pattern. So for example, one-way streets that had bus stops, the bus stops actually needed to change. People needed education on what side of the road to actually make these kinds of turns. And it made obviously a lot of signs that had to change so that people had the information. And how do you do that in some kind of incremental fashion? That was really the challenge that they had. And the answer was that it couldn't be incremental. It was going to need to be kind of all at once. And so the whole community, the whole country had to come together to make this happen in March 1967. And when the change started to happen, they agreed upon a day, this day in March 9th, that the switchover would begin. In different cities around the country, there was a window of time where travel was suspended, and people prepared for this change. And what's remarkable is that the change was incredibly orderly and relatively successful, actually, for people to make this switch. I can't imagine myself in the city of Phoenix that we have Thunderbird now, for this to happen in the downtown area with the neighbors and the population that we have. I think I can really appreciate the magnitude of the effort that was involved to make this happen. And initially, the results were pretty impressive. They had to switch over hundreds of thousands of signs. They switched over numbers of buses so that the buses would travel the appropriate way. They really had a coordinated effort there that paid off, and that, at least initially, the accidents decreased in the country. Pretty much the evidence suggests even for the next year. Perhaps that happened because people were more mindful about where they were driving. And at least it shows that the change was successful and no worse than before, pretty much normal to every other country that had similar kinds of travel patterns at the time or even today. So what does that have to do with Industry 4.0? Well, no analogy is perfect. Some of the learning that I can draw from an example such as H-Day there in Sweden is that the changes are massive, they're comprehensive, and they're touching everyone in the community. But Industry 4.0 isn't just germane to one country. It's really a global kind of effort that is affecting everyone with the way that they're thinking about their business models, thinking about the way that analytics or data is affecting how they're making decisions, how they're going to find and actually service customers. Now, many of us that have these kinds of digital access today on our smartphones, we know that. The apps are increasingly part of our lives. We don't think about using a telephone to dial a taxi. We have an Uber app or a Lyft app or other kinds of transportation at our fingertips. We know that many businesses are changing the way that they operate. It's actually changing their business models. So we have companies that might have thought of themselves as a manufacturer, many traditional kinds of companies doing heavy equipment. Instead of now just being a widget manufacturer, they're actually delivering services. Coming to mind, I would think of companies like Siemens or companies like Caterpillar that now find themselves in the service business. That's all part of this Industry 4.0. And today we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the B2C rather than B2B applications, but it's really pervasive. It's happening in every sector of the country or of the economy. That's why it's not hyperbole to say that the future of prosperity really will depend on how we adopt and utilize these kinds of technologies to serve our customers and fulfill our goals. Many of the luminaries of the field have recently been writing about this, and maybe you're reading similar kinds of takeaways that are coming from different authors. For example, AI making more decisions, that is artificial intelligence, about how business gets done. It's going to change the way that leadership is implemented. Different ways that we see digital revolution in healthcare, being able to detect disease maybe before it advances, maybe even better than humans can. Or we see applications like blockchain giving insight to entire supply chains so that we know for a fact the origin of the good and the components that actually went into that. So there's many, many applications of this that we're seeing across so many dimensions of the economy that even more recently we see that we're thinking about a new kind of globalization 4.0 as the World Economic Forum published just this last week. So it's a very pervasive, massive change, and I sort of link that back to the dog and H that we had talked about at the start. Another takeaway that we have that's linked to this phenomenon is that it's so pervasive, we're really going beyond what it means to be in business. It's affecting government, and it's the intersection of those entities with technology, at least it is for me. And so when I think about innovations in the space around big data, which is now becoming ubiquitous in the way that I sort of remember e-commerce had come and gone, where we used to make that sort of distinction that a company was an e-commerce company. You hear that less and less. It's sort of just assumed that there's some kind of digital channel. We're seeing that now with big data. It's assumed that there is going to be data available, more data than ever before. And that data is being used in applications like artificial intelligence and machine learning, which are understanding patterns in that data to help us make better decisions, better products, and deliver better services. We see things in the production efficiencies because we now know more about the actual performance of machines, and we can optimize those environments. So we're seeing entire infrastructures being discussed to be changed as part of this smart cities effort and other kinds of labor changes that are connected with Industry 4.0 in these sectors. It's a pretty big deal. So when I think about the leadership or the connections that we have with us as managers and leaders and our employees that we're working with, we really see new kinds of cross-functional collaborations that are needed to take advantage of all the sweeping changes across all those sectors. And we're going to be talking about this in a few examples just a little bit later today. And I really appreciate the effort that PwC did in looking at how pervasive and wide this is. This is one way of looking at it. We've heard others suggest that data scientists are, it was recently named the sexiest job that has sort of been supporting the Industry 4.0 changes. But if you look at the data that PwC has shared here, the number of jobs and roles that are just being affected by some kind of acumen that's needed with the data, it far outpaces the number of roles that are specifically focused on doing something with the data, like data scientists. And so when we see this kind of pervasive pattern that pretty much across every industry and pretty much across most jobs, if not all jobs, with any kind of mature sized company is going to be affected by using data analytics, we know that we have a significant change really is a new industrial revolution. So I think the name is fitting. So what does that have to do with digital transformation? Well, it's nice to know that the trend is going on, but we need organizations now to prepare themselves for that. And that's really where this digital transformation idea kind of gets started. There's really two camps. There's always been this sort of tension, I guess, between an individual leader sort of knowing maybe better than everyone else what the customer wants and producing that. So this often cited quote, which is by at least my research, actually not said by Henry Ford, but it's often attributed to him, that if he had asked people what they wanted when the Model A and Model Ts were being built, they would just ask for a faster horse. Obviously, that is a perspective that's very insular, looking at what they know best for the organization. And we can contrast that with Sloan, Alfred Sloan's comment that when he was working with GM at the time, that every car for a car for every purse and purpose. In other words, a product that would be specific, customized for different segments. So on the top, maybe you think you don't necessarily need as much outreach to customers because you might know it all, as the attribution to Henry Ford has it. And then Sloan is telling us, well, we need a lot of information about our customers. And I say in both camps, we see digital transformations happening. For companies that think they have the best solution, even entrepreneurs often think that digital transformation has something for them, more efficiencies and ways to actually execute that vision better. And then if we think that we need more information about the customers, which I think in my experience, this is much more where companies are gravitating toward, Industry 4.0 can allow, through digital transformations, us to know more about customers than ever before. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because you can look at your own smart devices with the apps that you have, which ones do you favor, and which ones you use the most and trust. Our whole experiences are being customized effectively for us through that app. Often we talk about in the classes that we have that there are certain music services that people like, and it's almost because they know your preferences. And that's what knits us together with these kinds of companies in the digital sphere. But the point is that there's something here for everyone. Now, putting that a little more fine point on that, what we're seeing is the confluence of technology, analytics, and leadership to make those kinds of visions happen. So when we think about these companies that are delivering new services to us, they have to have obviously appropriate networks and even sensors in the products themselves, thinking about serving our needs and customized to us. They have to have analytics in the background to look at patterns so that those features and functions that we so dearly love. I mean, I love my customized playlists that are recommended to me at 4 o'clock every day from the music apps that I use. We appreciate that, and we want to have that continue to work in our favor. And then obviously we need leaders with the appropriate vision to put that into place. And I think this is the point that we're going to touch on, and as we go into the talk a little bit more. And customers are benefiting from that. They're seeing all of those touch points. They're almost expecting that a service will somehow be customized to them and their needs. And if that's the objective, I think Sloan would be as happy as ever that we would be able to actually deliver on that vision for all those different segments that he was speaking about. Also, we see new functions being developed. Porter was one of the first in an HBR article that I know, and obviously I'm sure there was technologists writing about it earlier, talking about the strategic need for these functions across many of our organizations. Unified data functions that bring all that information together, whether customers are generating that or they're coming from kind of devices that they're using or the products that they're using in one place so that they're usable. We're seeing groups like DevOps, maybe your organization has one of these groups, which is a whole new way to develop products in a collaborative fashion. No longer do we assume that it's the responsibility of only R&D or only marketing to create a product. It's very much a collaborative effort, and you need that because the delivery of these kinds of digital solutions requires communication at a new level across all these functions. So we're seeing the advent of many more cross-functional teams to do work that might otherwise traditionally have been siloed in some way. And customer success, we're seeing that same thing on the marketing, sales, and customer service side. When a customer contacts us, think about the last time you contacted a company and you have to get transferred from one person to another. I recently had a colleague here at Thunderbird trying to get a flight booked to another country. And he was so frustrated. I could just hear the frustration in his voice as he was transferred from one agent to another, given a different story about what the rules would be to get a seat on the flight. But these are the kinds of things that we see every day that I think increasingly are going to be improved by this kind of vision when you bring these things together. Maybe your organization is going through some of that. And we're seeing new C-suite roles. I think for the first time, we're seeing chief data officers, chief analytic officers that are being appointed at very senior levels in order to manage these kinds of changes. And what's so interesting is that increasingly these executives with really senior roles appear to be coming from outside of the industry that they're necessarily hired into. And that's an advent that's really new. So we need to think about why would we be hiring somebody from outside of an industry in order to take such a senior role responsible really for data across the enterprise. Because now in Industry 4.0, when we're talking about data, we're talking about really the mission critical assets of what it means to do business. So why would that be happening? I've asked myself that question. I have a few answers today. Two examples of these chief data officers and analytic officers being hired very recently by some really large companies. Here, General Motors hiring Charles Thomas, recently State Farm, actually the same year, hiring Kirsten. Well, Charles came from Wells Fargo, not industry that's associated with transportation or cars in any way. Kirsten, she comes from Unilever. And so she's had an experience really in a consumer products company. So why do we see State Farm, primarily an insurance and a risk provider, bringing these people into the fold? Well, part of the answer is it's because they're seen as a transformation in chief, not just a chief data officer or digital officer. Just reflect on the kinds of roles these people are being asked to play in these organizations, propelling the digital transformation that we just spoke about to make sure that everyone across the company is getting the information that they need, which ultimately is the lifeblood of their function. Advocating for the company's digital efforts, which obviously will go internal and external to stakeholders to make sure that, again, they're either getting the data or the service that they need. Guiding management, which is really about the cultural change that's necessary to bring this about. And of course, providing direction. When I look at these elements that have been talked about by other authors, you know, the first element to me really strikes at one element about the kind of operational changes that are going to be needed. And then we have this other part that's really much more about, you know, culture. So I think transformation has really both of these elements. Maybe you see that in your organizations that are bringing this about. So I'm going to focus on each of these elements in turn here. When we look at a recent research by New Vantage partners, who I think are doing some great work in this field, and I'm also I'm familiar with them rather, because I had at Accenture, when I was with Accenture, Tom Davenport was one of my mentors, and he's also one of the partners there at New Vantage. And what they're finding is that executives say when they're in these roles, they definitely face technical challenges to get these things done. That is, how do we compete and be more nimble by bringing all that data in? Many of them are concerned about that. Many of them fear disruption from their competitors moving more quickly than they are at adopting these kinds of digital transformations, getting the information that they need to actually implement and execute their strategy. And well, nearly all of them are putting time, money, effort, resources into some kind of big data analytic project. That's significant. And maybe you can reflect on this when I look at the technical challenges to implement these kinds of big data analytic projects. They really fall into a number of categories. I think at least these 4 categories that I've outlined here. We see companies adopting sort of revenue generating external kinds of solutions using big data and AI. You can imagine, and you've experienced this yourself, if you've ever shopped at an online marketplace and you sort of get recommendations, hey, customers like you also like. So that could be an application where they're drawing on that big data to make a recommendation to you. And I'll be darned if it doesn't work on me, it probably works on you too. Just add that next item into the basket. Sometimes it's a helpful thing, actually. I didn't think about that before. Well, the AI has seen that pattern and is now making that recommendation. Amazon is definitely one of those companies that does that very well. Fraud detection. You know, we're so relieved when our bank or our credit card company, if we utilize them, flags something as unusual for those of us that are using those kinds of tools to make our purchases. And so we have AI in the background, you know, helping external to the company that is a customer figure out that, hey, this is really going to be something that's unusual, and maybe that removes the fraud and reduces the cost to the company, as well as the consumer if they're somehow liable for that. We see applications in environmental management. So using all that big data analytics, a building manager could look at the performance of the heating and cooling, the energy that's being used, and optimize that for the environment. We see those kinds of things also being used out a lot in industrial equipment or otherwise modifying the performance. As I've shared in discussions with many of our students, you know, companies today have the benefit of producing maybe one model of a car or some kind of equipment and then modify it through these kinds of connections because of the data to fulfill the needs for a specific market. So no longer or less often do you need to necessarily produce a different model for different markets. You might be able to produce one model and then just alter the performance through some kind of environmental management or performance management of that machine. And then we see it in customer service and order processing. Many companies are looking at patterns. Chatbots are becoming smarter. Many of you might be following, as eerie as it might sound. Recently, Google has now opened up their effectively digital assistant to make dinner reservations for you in many cities around the world. And you might also see this kind of logic being used for simple order processing to expedite an invoice being used. All of these are applications that might be more internal, but are revenue generating or otherwise producing new opportunities. So if we had a more easy way to interact, I was curious, but maybe you can reflect. What sort of big data analytic projects do you see? And maybe jot down what areas they are in, either A, B, C, or D. So when I've been talking to automotive executives, which is definitely one of the industries that's really affected by these digital transformations, what's curious to me or interesting to me relative to some of the other big initiatives that we've seen around, for example, Six Sigma, which was much more about a process improvement and efficiency, is they share that the reason why they're pursuing these digital transformations, it's about revenue generation. They're seeing huge opportunities to grow their market and change their business models for the better. So while there could be cost savings, and you see in this feedback that we got from interviews with executives, about 20% or so still recognize that there are cost savings. There's even more that say it's really about revenue generation. And it's not so much about optimization on its own. That's a big change from when I was coming up through consulting. The primary focus was on cost out through some kind of efficiencies, usually through a methodology like Six Sigma. So that's a big change. Building on that a little bit more, we also see that the challenge in getting these things implemented, these digital transformations to move that information around and deliver services like we're talking about, it's still a technology challenge is definitely there, particularly if there's legacy systems. I think this is interesting because startups, if you're an entrepreneur right now, you may be able to avoid that kind of legacy system and maybe move faster than some companies that are much bigger. And the larger companies, many of these automotive executives have been in companies in business for dozens or even many years, maybe even 50 or 100 years. They're reporting that the challenge is integration with the legacy systems. So we acknowledge there is definitely a technology side of the challenge, but that's not the whole story. When these executives that we were talking about say, yeah, we're pursuing all of these efforts to digitally transform our business, they're not being so effective. In fact, only less than 30%, according to New Vantage partners, had even created a data-driven culture. So that means that there's ways to go. And they note that the biggest challenge still remains with the culture. That is the company culture. As they quoted in the article, cultural challenges remain the biggest obstacle to business adoption, meaning these digital transformations. So that's going to be an idea that we want to hold on to. So why is that still such a challenge, the cultural challenge? Well, one of the reasons why it's such a big challenge is change. Change is still a difficult thing to do. Traditionally, when I was coming up into the practice for consulting, we thought about change very much in a linear model. That is, that we would have some kind of a vision that would be shared on what it is that we need to do. And we need to communicate about that. That communication is going to build awareness in employees. It's going to help build excitement, maybe momentum from the staff. And then, of course, we'll have to think about training for them. And then ultimately, they'll be committed and get on board. It's a very linear kind of lockstep approach, as if it's on rails, if you will. But what we're seeing in examples like, for example, the Kubler-Ross model that we're basing this kind of change on is when we were reflecting on why we were doing it that way is it was from a position of loss. So it was noted early on, some of the early change theorists noted that when you introduce a change to someone or something, it very much mimics a kind of a loss feeling. So you can imagine some kind of tragedy in someone's life. They typically go through these kinds of stages, that is denial or anger, and then depression, and then maybe acceptance, where they sort of come out the other side. And it was sort of that mindset that really developed this kind of linear thinking about change management being some kind of stage or step process. And we see this thinking in a number of other models that have influenced either management or psychology over the years. We have Maslow's learning model where, you might be unaware that you don't know something, and then you sort of know you don't know something, and then you sort of might learn and then feel that you have a competence after you've actually learned those new ideas or new information. In Lewin's model around social change, the whole notion of unfreezing, change, and refreezing. So again, a very kind of lockstep and linear sort of fashion. We also see this in a number of companies. We see, we feel, and we change, so says Kotter. So the idea over time is being linear in the relationship to performance. We had a model that was sort of like this, that there was a dip in the middle. So as people were going through that depressive kind of loss feeling, performance actually decreased. And they were having all kinds of negative feelings at the time. And we as change agents, we were really mindful that people have difficult time with change. And to some extent, we might all be able to relate to that. Maybe we've had a personal change or some kind of loss. And indeed, we did see very similar kinds of things being mimicked in organizations. If a role changes or a new system's introduced, people sort of like the old system and they want to keep the old ways. How many times we've seen that or maybe experienced it ourselves? We don't like that new system. We don't want to change the way we're doing our jobs. It's all that inertia that keeps it there. And so we felt a sense of loss. And you might see it this way, in the middle where we have that decrement of performance, it sort of feels like chaos a lot of times. And that's the Winchester Mansion in California in the US that literally has hallways that go nowhere, stairways that go nowhere. That feels pretty chaotic when we're in the middle of it. But I think that there's some fresh approach or new thinking that could be needed in digital transformations. Where do we go from here that might be a bit different? Because when I look at some of the digital changes that are coming about, it doesn't necessarily feel like loss. Think about when there's some kind of new release, like a new Apple iPhone that comes out. People literally are standing outside the store, sometimes camping overnight for days for the new release of that technology. Now, those old models would say that's really strange because I'm going to be giving up something and that's going to maybe affect me to feel depressed because I've paid a lot of money for that other device that I'm letting go. But this new iPhone is really exciting to them. I mean, I look at my kids and my kids seem pretty excited about it. They're jumping for joy when that new technology comes out. So those old models thinking that it's always about loss, they don't necessarily fit this sort of a situation. So I'm wondering, with digital transformation, I'm actually hearing from a lot of clients, a lot of executives, that sometimes these changes are really welcome. I think about a QA group, a quality assurance group for software development that I actually had at one of my prior roles. And they were adopting a digital solution to do QA management of software. They were thrilled when we actually turned that system on. They were empowered to do that, and many of them took their own initiative to learn that system faster than any training could be put together. So it didn't seem to me that it was always fitting the linear kinds of loss models that traditionally we had thought about as change agents. And indeed, when you think about what was happening there in Stockholm when that changeover happened, there's all kinds of different reactions probably to what was happening. And some of those people that might had a car that was already a left-hand drive car for primarily the right-hand side of the road, they're probably pretty excited about it. So again, I don't think that necessarily all those people were feeling a loss. So I reflected on this, like, is there a model or a set of models that don't necessarily predict a decrement in performance? And maybe the answer is it looks more like an innovation curve, where there are some early adopters, and then as we build momentum, performance actually increases. It doesn't decrease. So we can see that there are some of these kinds of models out there. I further was thinking, like, if you see that people are really excited about adopting the change, it's sort of like we just put them in a time machine and they can warp past that performance decrement. Maybe digital transformation borrows something from this kind of thinking. And is there a way for us as leaders, as managers, to adopt that so that we can actually help our teams in that time warp go from the current state of wherever they're doing to the new state? And that might mean that there's a new system, a new way to think about our customers, a new way to service them. Maybe people are actually excited and motivated to do that. Well, one of the things I learned, I had an opportunity to lead teams in New Zealand for one of the companies. I was running business operations for them. And we discovered that there was this notion of Koru that comes out of New Zealand. Koru is a spiral-shaped new fern that's about to grow. And it's really popular in, well, nowadays you see it everywhere. As a triathlete, I also see people taking this sort of spirit on for different tattoos. I've displayed some of those here. And so it really grows out of the Maori art that these sort of, this thinking of growth and life and strength and peace. And that's happening through change. So is there some kind of model that would allow us to reflect on that rather than the traditional models of loss and performance decrement? Maybe there's a way of thinking about it this way. So I was reflecting on the notion of resilience, because Koru is a way of thinking about renewal. And there are actually a number of different resilient models out there. We think about it from a personal perspective. If someone's resilient, they have a readiness, a capacity, even a passion for taking on some new challenge. We see that from a medical perspective. People who are resilient have emotional and spiritual and mental alignment physically to take on whatever the ailment might be. And so maybe there's another way that we could adopt some of that thinking. So I was reflecting on that, and this is very much just a practitioner's perspective of some of the trends. I think it's definitely worthy of research that we're continuing to do with teams today. Maybe there's eyes to model the fourth industrial revolution, the eyes of resilience for Industry 4.0. Maybe those eyes are something like inclusiveness, because we're seeing in a lot of case studies and reports coming out of companies going through digital transformation that it's inclusive. The leader of the change doesn't necessarily have all the information anymore, and they need partners in the business to help them with that. We see initiative, that is, it's a very much of an action-oriented view. We're encouraging people to have an idea and pursue that. And maybe the idea to support them through resilience is, what are the resources that they need? And how can we have a bias for action that actually gets results? We're seeing focus on insight, and that's really primarily around experimentation, which is, we're gonna wrap up our talk today on that kind of a notion, which is that maybe we can encourage people to try and do. That is, there's creativity here of someone in the business sees a new way to serve customers or a new way to solve a problem. And by adopting this kind of thinking, we should be empowering them to do that. And if in this digital transformation, they may actually see a new way of solving the problem faster than anyone else. And we finally see that it's integrative. So by having it integrate with the systems or the solutions that we have, we maybe can get greater value, exponential value out of a solution. I'll talk about a few financial examples that it does seem that that happens in companies that adopt this kind of a mindset. So maybe we need the 4 I's of resilience that would define Industry 4.0 for us, rather than thinking about it as change for loss. And maybe that's what New Vantage Partners is saying. Well, these leaders are in place and they're trying to create change, but they're having a challenge doing so. Maybe they're having a challenge doing so because we've been thinking about change in those other ways. So on the topic of experimentation, and just sharing a few examples, of course, of this happening, because I think this actually deserves an even greater topic. Experimentation can be a range of things for companies. Companies that are experimenting with their solutions have to obviously have a culture to support these leaders. I'll talk about both sides of this. It looks like it might be the little bit of the graphic is hidden maybe by an overlay, but you can get the gist of what I'm talking about here. Traditional projects, very much the idea that we're gathering requirements and trying to get all the facts right before we actually implement the change, is sort of a traditional way of looking at implementing some kind of an initiative. So I remember when, and maybe you do, when you're doing software development, about gathering requirements across so many different people in the organization, trying to lock things down, and then finally the change is introduced. Now, agile kind of projects sort of still, they definitely have the idea of changing fast, and there's different ways of doing that, of modeling that, and I think that gets us closer to the aspect of experimentation. But let's go to the other side at the far end, far right-hand side. Companies that are really at the forefront of this high experimentation, they're doing things like A/B testing. So obviously in a B2C environment, especially if you have some kind of a digital presence, you're able to look at performance of different website attributes to affect consumer behavior. So some of the examples, and I have the resources for you, so you can read these examples by these fine authors. Looking at Bing, for example. There are a number of different examples that people were looking at that search engine. One example had a hypothesis that if an ad was slightly bigger, but fewer of them on the screen, maybe it would be more attractive for people to actually click on the ads. And that idea got kicked around and implemented as a test. So it wasn't across the entire search engine. There's little segments that they would have for people to try out the feature. Well, it turned out to net over 50 million, if I recall the case correctly, of new revenue simply by adopting an actually a larger ad that would be more informative to a customer on what that product or service was. Amazon discovered something also similar. Maybe some of you actually might notice some of this, which is that they moved the offers for the Amazon credit card for the countries where they're offering that over to be near the actual basket of your checkout basket, rather than being advertised at other places. And that's been reported to net tens of thousands of more dollars in revenue for Amazon. So those things came about by this method of A/B testing, which is actually very common now in marketing. Many of us, unbeknownst to many of us, were actually part of these experiments. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook has said that there's thousands of different versions of Facebook being run at any one time. Amazon, by recent reporting, updates something in their Koru universe every 11 seconds. So we're talking about tens of thousands of these kinds of effectively experiments that are happening on us and affecting our performance all the time. Now, not all of us are in a business where that makes sense for us. Maybe we are not on the front lines and we want to be testing the environment that way on a website. Well, for that, if we take just a step back, I think it's the notion of adopting more pilots and prototypes. So for example, Ross here, I've given you the reference that you can follow up. She's done some excellent writing about this. 7-Eleven Japan, the shop owners very much can be locally focused. well, they can test out different goods that are maybe popular for the customers that are in their specific area. And they do that through effectively a hypothesis that they cast that those goods are going to be desired. And then they look at the ROI, whether those goods are actually being adopted and sold. And so it's very much a test and learn kind of a culture that they've developed there. Similar, DBS Singapore, unbelievably successful story for a bank that's now throughout that market and others in the Asia area. They are really successful thinking differently on how they're doing business with their customers. They actually, I believe one of their phrases is something like they want people to bank less, meaning that they want to not have the friction or the challenge for people to actually do business with them. I think the phrase is something like people bank so they can live, not live so they can bank. And that's a huge mindset shift for the kinds of solutions that they were actually able to create. And they've changed their philosophy, which has grown the bank, I believe it's like threefold. So some excellent examples there where they're doing that through pilots and testing. That is not necessarily full-scale projects, but finding a way to fortify the good idea, the innovations that might be observed by someone in the organization. So perhaps the takeaway for us as leaders, and perhaps those that have the challenge or the takeaway to pursue these kinds of digital transformations, maybe it looks something like this. Industry 4.0 is definitely aligning all these different kinds of factors, technology, analytics, to serve customers, or if you're not customer facing, just do your mission every day better using some kind of digital solution. We also see that resilience may offer some new ways for us to think about change. I think that it's inspiring to think that teams might be gravitating toward these solutions. So now my role as a leader isn't necessarily to steward, or isn't necessarily to guide them directly, but to steward or to help remove the barriers in a new way, in a different way than I did when I was assuming that everyone was going to have a sense of loss. Which often has been associated with the idea of change. And finally, we see this adoption of maybe a test and learn mentality, organizational cultures adopting experimentation for them to report then greater success, adopting these digital transformations. And this could be a new way of us as leaders adopting the challenge to help companies, help our clients, and help our employees actually adopt solutions that are connected to Digital 4.0. I find that pretty exciting. So wish it was a little bit more interactive there, but given the format, I appreciate the opportunity to at least share some of those ideas. And I would be interested to hear either you see some of these patterns in your organization, or if you have some questions about that, as best we can address that in the time we have remaining.
That was great. Everybody, if you want, go right ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A box down below. There's the chat feature. Well, I'll read some of the comments. But if you can go ahead and submit your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And by the way, Russ says, excellent presentation on DT and most timely. He likes the example given on use of blockchain for supply chain. Getting it in place is another thing.
Oh, yeah.
Referring to points made below, McKinsey, 3 key principles as minimum conditions for progress. 1, organizations must start with a problem. 2, there must be clear business case and target ROI. And 3, companies must agree to mandate and commit to a path to adoption. Your thoughts?
Right, well, great observations there. I think that it's fully aligned, and I think I remember reading those same sort of details as I was preparing for this, and as other things that are related to this. There's a confluence of evidence here that this is still very much a metric driven, and I think that some of the evidence that I'm reading is that those companies that are more mature in adopting these solutions, whether it's trying to get the blockchain solution in place or any of these digital solutions, they definitely are still being very clear about the vision, which is a goal that's really clearly communicated. I don't think that that's necessarily ever changed. But then I do think that there's a new emphasis on those metrics and the KPIs that are related to the change. It seems to me to be related to the idea that we have more data than ever before. We have more systems that are helping us manage that. So we should be more mindful. I don't think that necessarily has gone away. And what I think is new is that maybe in the past, without having the benefit of the data and the metrics, it was maybe a nice to have the idea that you could launch a pilot or launch some kind of team to explore an idea. And maybe we gave them the support and budget to do that, but we didn't expect much. But as we're adding actually the way to measure the impact, I think it takes on a whole new significance. And it allows them to feel that there's some, I guess the word that I'm looking for is there's efficacy in that the action that they're taking, they're seeing a result. It's very gratifying and satisfying. Most of the examples, and I only shared a few top line today, I've given you the resources. It's amazing the success that a number of companies are doing these things. For example, with the A/B testing models like that. They're definitely doing a rapid fire number of these, and most of them actually do not have significant results or as significant results as I shared today. But that's a pattern of allowing those groups to do that I think are focused on the metrics. So I'm fully aligned, I think, with, I think that was McKinsey's suggestion of best practices or top line things that are related. And I think they're among a slew of research and authors that are focused on that. So I think that we do want to make sure we keep our eye on that. And that, I think, is a way of actually empowering, not detracting from the effort of the teams that we allow to do it, as we're being, supportive of them.
Awesome. Jollery says that I thought that moving away to a linear approach to change was key as well. And
right.
Go ahead.
I think. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Maybe there was a delay.
Oh, no. Go ahead.
So yeah, I think that I mean, myself, I came up into the practice with Accenture through change. Being a practitioner first of change, and really I've done that throughout my career. And I think that there's something different about these digital transformations. And I shared with you today. It seems to me that increasingly you're seeing people on their own volition. If we allow them this idea to adopt that, I don't remember people rushing out the door to necessarily adopt all these kinds of enterprise systems. Name your top system. People often felt that it was sort of being imposed upon them. So that sort of struck me that maybe we can have a different way of thinking about this, a more nonlinear way. And it might mean that the pattern of changes could happen at different speeds for different people, which I think we always knew. But we really, in our change programs, and I'm guilty of this, I think that with many clients, we sort of had a lockstep. We knew individual differences would happen, but the program was pretty much, sort of coordinated that way. We needed a communication plan. We need certain executives to say certain things at certain times. And there was going to be, some kind of big crescendo at some kind of town hall that was happening. Well, what if there's this new model? I mean, Apple announces something and people flock to it. So I think maybe it's fortifying the appropriate people with the appropriate support and giving them a new structure. It's probably going to be a cross-functional structure also to allow people to do that. One example I failed to mention earlier is Baidu, the Chinese, I guess think of them as an internet company, internet search engine company. One of the solutions that Baidu put in place was allow employees to actually select managers to work with. So you can imagine the kind of, well, there could be challenges with that, but imagine how you could maybe align employees that are interested in these ideas. So I could imagine myself as, a certain level of executive of a company empowering certain managers to have projects, test and learn initiatives, and then allow employees to align themselves to those managers. That's a very liberating, different kind of idea, a different kind of change. And I'm not the only one to think about it. There's many of these people that are talking about resilience. But I think the Industry 4.0, we need some new kind of thinking here. I don't think that the linear models are always appropriate as maybe our one-trick pony that we used to roll out in the past. And that's very exciting. And so we should see how we can make that happen where it's appropriate in organizations.
So Naveen, says, is there a platform where experimentations are shared between companies? And where is the knowledge hub for Industry 4.0?
Huh. Well, okay. Well, on the first part, is there a place where they're sharing? You know, I think that you see, for example, the one example that I shared, you know, when you have a luminary kind of author that's writing about it, the example is we're all through Microsoft, and I'm sure those were vetted through a number of you know, checks and balances. But you know, people consider these kinds of test and learn strategies to be pretty much proprietary and protective. Um, I don't want to endorse any one company, but you can look at companies that specialize in either tools or software to help companies do that, particularly on the A/B testing side. And you'll see, I think there are case studies where obviously when it's shared that way, it's sort of out, at least in the public domain, to see their success stories. I always read those. Obviously, they have to be balanced because the company's going to tout probably the biggest and best that they can. No, you know, nothing wrong with that. That's just the way it goes, to try to put it in the best light. But I'm unaware of a sort of a knowledge share or a marketplace where that's happening. It might be happening more on other kinds of tools or other kinds of communities, that individuals that are participating. You know, particularly there's a number of those communities for tech specialists and things like that. So I don't know of that, and maybe we need to create one. Maybe Thunderbird could be a place that we allow companies to share and learn from each other by networking. So I think that's a great idea. Now, I pontificated on that so much, I forgot the second part of the question. So,
And where is the knowledge hub for Industry 4.0?
yeah, I mean, I think right now, even among colleagues that I network with in and outside of our school, I don't think that there is a single place. And I think that part of it is because it's such a broad effort. You're not just talking about, you're talking about public and private industries. There are certain publications that I think do have their finger on the pulse of that. And they're the same ones that you probably are familiar with. I think Sloan, MIT Sloan Management Review, HBR is doing a very good job following that. World Economic Forum. So I guess maybe the World Economic Forum might be one place to look. We have a new professor that's joining us soon that has been very successful and influential on the things that are happening there. I know our new dean, Sanjeev, has been very active with the kind of thought leadership that's coming out of there. So I think you're looking at, you know, if there is a nexus, and really World Economic Forum is one of the places where a lot of these things got started and gave life and had structure, which we really needed as a discipline to start to take action on this. So maybe those are some of those places, but I'm trying to think about other kinds of patterns where it might be really obvious, like, oh, sure, there's a, you know, there's this GitHub group, or there's, you know, this place on Slack that we can all go and join. I just don't think there is one of those. I think there's many of those. And I think it reflects, because we're talking about a really big pattern here, which I tried to frame up at the start of the talk today.
All right, and we have Pam, and I'm just going to go ahead and answer her question. She says, will we be able to get a copy of this for later viewing? And everyone, yes, you will be able to get a copy of this. An email will be sent out for everyone, and it will also be posted on our Thunderbird YouTube page. So hopefully, Pam, you can go ahead and take care of your projects and also view this a little later. We have Mike Greto, who had commented saying, I think that open source is pretty open forum for knowledge sharing, code sharing, etc.
I think that's a good point. I mean, there's really been a shot across the bow for those in the industry. If you're following what some of the moves that are happening now, both Google and Amazon Web Services, AWS, if you read between the lines, or the tea leaves, if you will, mixing my analogies there, I think that there is sort of this idea of opening up. And I think it's a very interesting model that they're talking about. So I'd encourage you to go look at some of the announcements that came out of Google's industry conference just this past week, just happened to be by time or just in the news. You have to look at what I'm seeing is that many things that we used to think we needed bespoke, custom kinds of solutions to adopt Industry 4.0, they're quickly becoming standardized, something that you would say it's point and click. Many of us, dating myself a little, remember the days where you needed to maybe hire specialists to help build a website. But now it's so simple to have a website sort of turnkey through any number of providers. And those kinds of things are starting to happen now for big data analytics. We're talking about putting artificial intelligence and machine learning into the cloud at pretty much the push of a button and move entire enterprise functions that we used to need special software for into the cloud. So it's maturing very quickly, and I think that's what's so exciting about this space. And that's affecting all the ways that we work and manage. I see a lot of opportunities for that.
So it looks like we have one more question. Is there a set of steps or a handbook which guides digital transformation principles in at least 40,000 foot view by industry or domain? Till now, it all seems very high-level customer company perspectives and perspective changes which different in-house and external consultant to try to fill.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. You know, I have my days are spent with just trying to keep up with a number of different research feeds that I have out there to try to keep my pulse on it all. No, I don't necessarily see as, again, I guess it's interesting, you know, sort of two questions on, is there a way to, is there one place, is there a source, is there a place that can say by industry or, you know, and I'm not seeing that. So I think I gave you a few and you're able to see some of the kind of authors and entities that are publishing these. I would encourage you to follow them. Wall Street Journal has a series on just sort of the future of everything. These are the kinds of things that are worth sort of monitoring. They're very global actually in their focus with applications. And then from there, you're able to kind of branch off. But we're talking about something that's ephemeral. It's kind of everywhere and nowhere all at once. And so I think you have to look at your industry and see what folks are doing. And also don't take your eye off of what another industry is doing. I gave you two examples today. I mean, if you would have told me that State Farm and General Motors would hire a senior executive outside of their field to run something as sensitive as their data analytic functions, I would have been surprised a few years ago. And that shows you that they're adopting best practices from these other industries. So it's not just one industry, it's looking across and then maybe translating that for your own. Yeah. Great questions.
All right, well, it looks like there are no other questions. Like I said, I'm going to be sending this out to everyone who had signed up. And if you do have any more questions, here at Thunderbird, we have our Thunderbird Executive Education Department, as well as other degree programs. But we're here to think about Industry 4.0. We're here to provide information about more changes that are coming up and produce thoughts and conversations about these topics. So go ahead and email us at exec.ed@thunderbird.asu.edu and we can get you connected with more information about these programs. Thank you, Dr. Lynch, and I hope everybody has a great day.